Hey superstars, welcome back to another episode of Word Up with Dani Katz. Today I am joined by psychedelic writer, researcher, and author Vincent Rado. If you tune into my podcast that I do with Emily Moyer, then you'll know that we had Vincent on maybe I don't know the timing, but we had Vincent on to discuss some of the psychedelic opportunistic ops going on in Ukraine. I was first introduced to Vincent through our mutual friend, Robert Forte, and I wanted to have Vincent on to start to walk us through the op that is psychedelic culture in America, which as we know from the series that Emily and I have done with Robert Forte, that the psychedelic movement in the United States is anything but organic, but was ever and always an op that was backed by the elites, military industrial complex, et cetera, et cetera. So I wanted to have Vincent on to help bring us up to speed as to how the military industrial complex has been using psychedelics to control the population, to socially engineer us, to make a lot of money, all of those things. Vincent his breadth of knowledge on the subject, as well as on American politics, world history, is pretty phenomenal. And I just am in awe of how he weaves it all together to shed light on what seems like a counterculture movement, but really is anything but. Before we dive into today's freaking awesome episode with Vincent, I am reminding you to click that subscribe button, to like, to share, to comment. Your comments go a long way in nudging me ever higher in algorithmic hierarchy, thus giving me more reach. As well, why don't you go ahead and click the notification bell? Because that way you will be notified every time I drop a new video, whether it's a Word Up podcast episode, a Words Are Matter video, which features, quantum languaging insights, planetary service announcement, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. You will be notified. And still, that being said, Google sometimes is a little bit afraid of me and the powerful content that I share. So they don't always necessarily let folks know when I drop something. So just to be on the super safe side, I recommend signing up for my newsletter at danikatz.com. When you sign up, you will get a free PDF, 5 quantum languaging hacks for instant empowerment. That's right, I did say instant empowerment. I never share your information. I send out newsletters very rarely, only when I have value to share, offers to put into your field. It's a great way to keep up with my book launch, live events, all of which are happening right now. So last piece, this podcast, like most of my podcasts, is split into 2 halves. So the first half is free for the public on all of the audio podcast platforms, as well as a bunch of alternative audio podcast platforms. It is available in video format on YouTube and on my locals page. The second half is reserved for my paying supporters on both locals and Patreon. So links are below. Choose the platform of your choice. And for as little as $5 a month, you will get access to all of my second half podcast conversations. If you are someone who is interested in the podcast that I do with Emily Moyer, because that one is super spicy and gets us majorly censored, that whole podcast is behind a paywall. So if you're interested, you can sign up for that at wordspodcast.locals.com, or it is available for all of my personal $10 and up supporters on Locals and on Patreon. So I just share that so that as you're choosing, your tiers of support for me, know that $5 is the minimum to get access to my second half conversations. $10 gets you access to Words podcast that I do with Emily Moyer. Okay, I think that does it for housekeeping. Buckle up and prepare to enjoy my conversation with Vincent Rado. fascinated by how you know what you know and how you got into this realm of research and writing.
Right, yeah. If you'd like, I could talk more about like some of my personal background, I guess. Yeah. So I was born just outside of DC, and I was raised in and around the city. So I've always been around the capital, which in the DC area, politics are just kind of like in the air. Sorry, do you mind if I just take a couple hits real quick first? I'm sorry, I just need to stop this and start over again.
Yeah, no worries. Take your
Yeah,
time.
I really need to smoke. I'm actually a medical patient and I haven't really had my medicine today. So if you could just give me 2 seconds to just take a couple of hits real quick. I'm really sorry about
Yeah,
that.
yeah, take your time.
Totally. Oh, sorry. Yeah, this was just kind of off the record.
Okay, yeah, as you're open, but I'm just so curious to know how you got into this specific line of inquiry because it's so rare these days and you're so attuned um,
Okay.
to the psychedelics ops. So I'm very curious. As long as you're comfortable sharing how you got
Oh,
here.
of course. Oh, for sure. Yeah, totally. I was just trying to gather my thoughts because there's so much that has happened. But to keep it in a nutshell for listeners so it's easy to follow along, I mean, I really don't think there's anything special about how I got into the drugs. I say that because our entire society is conditioned to be obsessed with drugs. And that has been the norm since the beginning of the US, really. Even back to when it was still just colonies. The politics, the economy, the social life has all been like drug based. So in that sense, I don't really consider myself like unique or special. The only way I might be like, well, it's not even unique because there's a bunch of other people out there who have done this is even though uh illegal drugs in some conversations might be taboo, I decided to devote myself to them just because I thought they were interesting. And I had seen there was a long history of people who had devoted their careers to drugs and they had careers. So it was possible. And at the
Who are
time,
who are some of the people who influenced you in that respect?
yeah, I mean, when I like really decided to dive into all this, I was reading a lot of Terrence McKenna. Um, I grew up reading Allen Ginsberg and Bill Burroughs. They were like my heroes through like much of my life. Now I am not sure I would call them my heroes just because I've learned so much about them now that I see that, you know, there's not like nobody is perfect. So I wouldn't hold up any of these people now as like role models, right? But at the time, those were a lot of, I mean, I was reading Aldous Huxley, The Doors of Perception. A lot of this is just like the classic like drug propaganda that goes around our culture, you know, like, and I mean, like my dad read The Doors of Perception like in the 50s when he was my age, you know, like this is not even anything new. Um, so I was just like another kid trying to get high in America. You know, it's not really too unique, but I was exposed to all these figures, and at that time in my life, I was consciously turning away from the music industry. So I was actually kind of like raised in the music business, played and performed for over a decade in and around DC with a bunch of different bands. Eventually I got kind of fed up with the music scene and I needed to turn my life in a different direction. And I happened to be very interested in the drugs, and I saw that there were a number of other figures out there who had made careers out of it. And that's what was close to my heart. And for whatever crazy reason, I just decided to jump into it. And even though friends and family were concerned, like, is this like really what you want to be spending your time on? Like, what's going on here? Very soon, like, so just to fast forward a little bit, I mean, I, was reading all these books and doing drugs as a teenager and stuff, but I, um, when I did actually get around to starting a DC psychedelic society, which is a harm reduction and education group in DC that I started 6 years ago. We aren't really too active these days. We have the occasional potluck and meeting and stuff, but back when I first started the group, very quickly we gained a lot of attention, a lot of traction, hundreds of members on Facebook within like a couple weeks, a few days even. It was like just, it was like a mushroom cloud. Like there was really wide demand for this. And as soon as I announced that I was willing to be the guy to talk to about it, tons of people were saying, oh my gosh, let me tell you about this, let me tell you about this. So, and I think I mentioned this in our last talk, but and this has changed now that it's gotten really big, but like a few years ago, and it's, I'm sure if you go back in history, it was even more so. The scene of people who have dedicated their time to this, it is kind of like a small-ish crowd. So pretty quickly, it's easy to get introduced to a lot of movers and shakers and some pretty big names. So I guess I'm saying all this to say that this all just basically confirmed my suspicions that, like, even though drugs are taboo, actually there's a very wide interest in them. A lot of people don't think of them as taboo and they actually want to talk about them. And yeah, we had huge meetings. Like the first year or two, we would have a meeting and a special event each month, and they almost always would draw a pretty good crowd, and there were always lots of people who wanted to talk about the psychedelics and drugs and the history of all this and the politics of it and where it's going and the medicine and the science and whatnot. So if anything, I just kind of like tapped into like a cultural thing that was already happening. It's really not anything too unique about myself. I could say more, but I guess that's kind of like in a nutshell, kind of I don't know if that answers your question, kind of, sort of.
When did you start to clue in to the up? Like, when did you start to figure out that the books that had inspired you were in fact propaganda?
Yeah, okay. So it was it is a process. I mean, arguably I'm still figuring it all out. But just to give some background for people, like before I started to study this angle of it, I had read here and there about how the CIA used acid and mind control experiments during the Cold War, and they deleted all the documents and all that, right? And I thought it was an interesting quirk of history, but I didn't really think there was that much to it. And every now and then, as I was getting the Psych Society going, I would hear people be like, aren't you concerned about like the history of the CIA and all this, and the fact that the government like kind of was running all this back in the day and all this kind of stuff? And I would just kind of like laugh it off and be like, oh, like, you're just seeing your own enemies, like you gotta like manifest positivity and all that crap, you know what I mean? And I just didn't want to think about it, even though I had been exposed to it. And in fact, there's this book out there that I highly recommend called Acid Dreams by, you're nodding, I'm assuming that you know it, by Martin Lee and Bruce Lane. And I had actually read that book, I don't know, as like a teenager or in college or something. And even though almost the whole book is about the connections between the acid scene and the CIA, I managed to read the book the whole way through and just totally tune out all the CIA stuff, which I manage is what a lot of people do, like when they read this stuff.
I think I did the exact same thing. I read it in
Yeah,
college as well. Like I
yeah,
didn't make the connection then.
yeah, yeah. It was like, ooh, Tim Leary, like the Grateful Dead, like cool. I was reading about all that stuff and the CIA, blah blah blah. Alan Dulles, okay, whatever. I didn't really know like what it meant or why it would matter, you know. But when it really started to change, right? To get to your question, so I started the group in 2017, and in 2018, after we had been around for only about a year or so, I heard that MAPS, the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies, that I'm sure many of our listeners are already well aware of, I heard the news that they had just taken $1 million from the Mercer family. And for people who are not aware, the Mercers were very large donors of Trump's 2016 campaign. The patriarch of the family, I don't know if it was through IBM or one of the other big computer companies, but they made their money in the tech boom in the 80s and the 90s, and they're extraordinarily rich, and they're political donors, extremely conservative, arguably fascist, and they were very considerable backers that helped get Trump into office. And when I learned the information, it almost didn't compute at first, but after I sat with it for even just like, well, I learned it at a conference, and it was all developing pretty rapidly, so we were all talking about it, and I I I, I realized over time that this was confirming, like, well, anyway, I'm going down a rabbit hole, but to keep it to your question, so that was like kind of the first of the light bulbs where I was like, wait a minute, this is not right. Like, why are they taking money from Trump's donors to try to medicalize MDMA for like world peace and all this stuff? It's just, I was like, whoa, this is weird. But of course, to anyone who is familiar with what MAPS is doing, they've been working with the Department of Defense and the Drug Enforcement Administration since their beginning. I mean, the whole purpose of MAPS is to craft a government-approved pathway for these drugs to reach the market. And with almost every single case in history of a popular drug, that pathway to market has been paved by the military. So the fact that it's happening again with MDMA, you know, at the time I didn't know all the history to put this in place, but it just felt wrong to me. And that kind of put me on alert, and I began to pay attention. I mean, there were things here and there I had heard about the scene that were kind of bothering me, but that was a really big one.
What were some
Um,
of the other things that were that just weren't sitting right with you?
um, well, I mean, there's a pretty long history of abuse that happens while people are under the influence of LSD, ayahuasca, ketamine. I mean, any drug, right? Alcohol, like people will use any drug out there to manipulate and abuse other people. But with the drugs that we refer to as psychedelics, even though there's this cultural aura of like positivity and healing around them, if you spend time around people who like, well, I don't want to extrapolate to others. What happened to me is I just was hearing about people who had been physically abused by the leaders of like ayahuasca circles and all that kind of stuff. And it is becoming more documented now. I mean, if people go search abuse ayahuasca, for example, there's more material out there now, which is good because we need to talk about it, but we still haven't like figured out a real answer for that problem. But that's one. And then I had also heard just vague kind of comments about like uh where the money was coming from, but like maybe people wouldn't drop explicit names, but like maybe like there would just be hints about, oh yeah, well, they're considering certain donors that are not cool. And it just would be kind of like, well, like, what does that mean? And at first I didn't really have anything substantial to connect it to, but over time, as I started to hear more, and then I took it upon myself to really study the history and go back, and like I went back and read Acid Dreams again from cover to cover, and this time I made sure to pay attention to every single thing about the CIA, and it was almost like I was reading a totally different book. And Acid Dreams is a good one, and it definitely had an impact on me. I mean, I've read it at this point 3-ish times. I highly recommend it for anyone who's trying to understand the history of the connection between the psychedelics and the government and the military and all this kind of stuff. But then as far as other specific things that happened, so I mean, like one thing that was interesting to me is like when the pandemic hit, I noticed that a lot of the new psychedelic companies made their IPOs on Wall Street. But meanwhile, like I lost my job because the pandemic, with the shutdown and stuff. And I wasn't the only one. So in my circle who went through that. So I noticed, like, for example, okay, there's a huge economic shift happening right now. And the people like myself who have been on the ground, like putting in the hours, having conversations with people, to really do the groundwork to make this change possible, we're getting laid off. And the people who don't even know what they're talking about, who happen to have inherited like a few $1 million from their rich parents, are making even more millions of dollars now on these products that they don't even really understand. And it kind of hit me as like, okay, this is it. I guess it was a moment when I realized how quickly this all was moving in a direction that was clearly not beneficial for the public. And that was when I really decided to like just buckle down. And at that point I was already working on my last book, Drugism, which there's excerpts and stuff out there for people who want to read it. But originally the last chapter in Drugism was going to be about how people in power use drugs, both on themselves and on other people, or how they manipulate the policy or the markets and whatnot. But as I began to research that, I realized there's no way I could fit a comprehensive story of that into just one chapter. And I realized it needed its own book. So that's what I'm almost done with now, is my next book, which is called High and Mighty, How People in Power Use Drugs. And
Great
I mean,
title. That is a fantastic title.
Thank you. I appreciate that. And yeah, so as I said, it was originally going to be the last chapter of my last book. So in that sense, I've already been working on it for 3, 4, 5 years now. But I published Drugism a year ago. So for the last year, I've been just totally devoted to finishing this book and as comprehensively as possible, understanding the history of the relationship between various governments and drug markets, both legal and illegal, and how that relates to the political history and all this kind of all this kind of stuff. So I hope, I don't know if that kind of answers.
Yeah, it's helpful. I have like a million questions, so I'm gonna do my best to tailor.
I'm happy to answer as many as we can fit in, you know what I mean?
So, I mean, slowing it down, why the military specifically?
Okay, so in a nutshell, it's because the military in any given state or empire or nation has historically often acted as the motor of economic activity. And there's tons of different like reasons for this. There's books and books and books and books written about this, but I mean, arguably what it boils down to is especially capitalism and a lot of other political and economic systems that have existed through history, particularly in the West, although it's true all over the world. Um, uh, they have almost all been based upon war as a means to expand their access to trade, their access to people, their control of land. So this is actually the case for not only drugs, but many industries, actually. If you examine their history, you'll find that they experience boom cycles after being affiliated with like military technology or something.
Mhm.
And with the drugs, I argue that this traces back to salt. So this is gonna, it might sound totally random to people, but for those listeners who have read some of my material, may be familiar with the history of salt, which to tie it to warfare and the boom cycles and all that. So the word soldier actually derives from the French word for salt, because historically in Europe and in ancient Rome, and I believe in ancient China and probably throughout much of the rest of the world, um, troops and militaries have been paid with salt, especially when there isn't enough hard currency to go around. And there's actually, there's multiple reasons for this. The direct application to warfare is that troops that troops that have been fed salt will generally be more nourished, more active. They'll have more energy to fight. They'll last longer. Additionally, salt actually, it dehydrates food, which helps the food rations last longer. This was a huge part of its use in history, was to preserve food. So not only did salt actually provide an immediate boost upon the consumption, but it helps to preserve the food rations, which for military ventures was extremely important. And for all of these reasons and more, we see time and time again in a lot of the world's largest empires that during times of war, the salt supply would be reserved for the military, and the state or the governing body would make sure to secure a supply of salt that would last the troops to get through whatever war or military campaign they were doing at the moment. And then any salt that was left over from the military would be what was allowed for the general population. And this trend of conserving salt to be used in the military, and at the same time, so like often when this would happen, there would actually be a ration on the amount of salt that would be available for sale to the public. And then after the war was over, the salt ration would end. The troops would come back home. Oftentimes the troops would be loaded with salt because they would have been receiving the military rations of salt that all the salt had been reserved for. And wars and militaries would, in this sense, act as a marker of kind of like state control over a market. And that might sound really abstract, but to make it more concrete for people. So this practice began in ancient China. It was then replicated in ancient Rome. And then a lot of the early nations and kingdoms in what we know as Europe also would do this. And what's interesting is that we find as the most popular drugs enter into global consumption, often they become popular during wars, and B, this is often because the military itself serves as a vector for the drug. And this,
How so?
okay, so on the one hand, we have the same thing going on with salt, where we have the government actually during times of war will create or hoard a stockpile of drugs to be used for the military. And then the troops will be given priority in access to drugs, often the most important drugs. And then, so in that sense, you have a kind of state-created levy that kind of keeps the drugs close to the military so that during warfare, the troops can maintain themselves and be healthy and nourished and continue to fight. But on the other hand, it goes back to the main purpose of warfare to begin with, which is the primary function of war is as the motor of our economy, and it often serves to expand the array of commodities that an empire or nation has access to. So like, for example, the common thing in like the recent history that a lot of people will be familiar with is the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan and the oil, and with Ukraine now, there's tons of resources over there, and we were kind of talking about some of this in our last call with Emily. But the reason this has to do with drugs is because often when a given empire or nation first becomes exposed to a particular drug, it's through a military campaign or warfare. Like, for example, the Crusades in Europe functioned as a way that the Catholic population in Europe was exposed to the drugs and the medical sciences of the various Arabic kingdoms that they were trying to convert, which at the time were much more advanced. So like a lot of the Arabic doctors had figured out various formulas for opium and hashish and even cane sugar that were just not available to Europe at the time. And it was only through the violent conquest of those populations that the Europeans then learned about these drugs and then incorporated them into their own trade cycles. So you have kind of like all these different directions upon which war kind of serves as like a vehicle for the popularization of drugs. Again, I would say it goes back to salt, but you'll find the same trend with like opioids, or during World War I, it was cocaine. During World War II, it was amphetamines, like the speed that not only the Nazis and the Japanese, but also the US troops and the British, all of them were on speed during World War II. And most militaries to this day use some form of amphetamine that is available to troops in active combat to keep them alert on the field. So, I mean, historically, there's just so many forces that play into this. And then as for specifically with like the LSD and the MDMA and stuff like that, arguably the war that gave rise to those drugs was the Cold War, which was kind of like the battle of the mind and the ideology that the various hemispheres would subscribe to. And in much the same way that various wars through history have served to popularize the use of particular drugs, LSD was popularized specifically in the context of the Cold War with Russia and China, in which there was an explicit desire among like not only the US government, but the Russian government and others to figure out how to use drugs as truth serums, as behavior modification agents, any kind of way that they could gain an advantage on their enemy. And this, what's interesting is that if, you know, like in going back and reading the documents for this, they were interested in drugs that could be used not only on the battlefield, but off the battlefield as well, to influence a civilian population, for example. So, and this is all documented. But anyway, so yeah, I'm kind of rambling, but, and I'm happy if there's specific things you want to dig into, or, you know.
Yeah, I thank you so much. Your breadth of knowledge on this is just, it's fantastic. It's fascinating. It's illuminating in the way that like salt was given to the soldiers for their own health, for their own food preservation. Is our military giving psychedelics to our soldiers?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. So, okay. So this actually, oh, I'm glad you brought that up because this brings up another very crucial, what was for me personally a turning point in my relationship with this whole industry. You know, I don't even want to call it a movement because it's, but anyway, to answer your question, yes, the US military has already engaged in giving MDMA to active duty troops. And US military personnel have stated in public that their goal in the use of MDMA for active duty troops is to extend the window of operability that a troop has on the battlefield. In other words, if some dude goes over anywhere, a few years ago it was Afghanistan, but now it could be like Ukraine or anywhere that the military like as for folks who may say, oh, but the US doesn't have troops over there. Well, there is Operation Atlantic Resolve going on. A few thousand troops were just mobilized to Europe as part of that. But excuse me, oh my God. Yeah, yikes. But
Okay.
So I actually learned this in 2017. It was crazy because it was so soon after I started the group. This was one of the pieces of information that I learned. And for some context is I had become involved in what was essentially like a multi-continent, like multi-group online talk that was given to a bunch of different groups all over the US and Australia. There may have been a couple in Europe, by Rick Doblin and Dennis McKenna. And during Rick's talk, he mentioned this, which was, he said, he was explaining what MAPS has been up to lately and how the cultural climate toward MDMA is changing, and the FDA has been showing more approval toward these therapies. And he said, and it turns out that MAPS recently learned that the military has performed studies with active duty troops and MDMA. And Rick said that they learned that as an accident, as if they weren't supposed to know this information. But he said all this proudly. And I've seen since in other talks, he has said this in other talks from the same time period. So I don't believe that this was just a casual comment that entered his mind that he felt like sharing. I think this was a piece of information that he made a point to share with not only my audience, but other audiences. And this is documented. It's documented on YouTube, actually. There's a talk from the talk that Rick and Dennis gave for all the psychedelic groups where he says this. And then there's also an article that was written recently by Russell Hausfeld. I forget, I want to say the name of the publication is Truth Dig, but he did a piece that was like a very brief little expose on how Rick has made comments about, oh yes, the military has told us that they're already giving MDMA to active duty troops, but we're not supposed to know this, and that's all I know. And then he talks about some other stuff. And he dropped that into this talk about like, oh, we're gonna achieve MDMA medicalization, it's gonna be great, we're gonna solve PTSD, all this kind of stuff. And again, at the time, I didn't really know enough to plug this all in, but as I learned more, that stuck out to me as a moment where it was kind of like, this is really weird. Like, and so to answer your question anyway, yeah, yes, that has already happened. Rick said that it's under the auspices of like a study, and he says that he was not supposed to know about it, but the military has a long history of doing all kinds of stuff under the auspices of like a study or an experiment that are actively contributing to combat. I mean, this has been documented at least since World War II, if not earlier. So like, that was a huge turning point as well for me, and just a huge clue that this is still going on right now. This isn't like some Cold War artifact of history that the military used to do this kind of stuff. Like, I can tell you, as an organizer, Rick Doblin said at one of our events that the military was giving MDMA to active duty troops. And this was within the last few years. So like, do with that information what you will, you know? But that was one of like many other things that just got me down this path. And, you know, so yeah, there's a lot to it. And then we of course talked in our last episode about how there's a new essentially astroturf that has emerged in Ukraine that is lobbying the Ukrainian government to create a private sector for psychedelic drugs over there that is actually connected to state officials and private sector people and Wall Street people and pharma people from here that are working with the psychedelics and stuff. So yeah, I mean, it's all, there's a lot going on right now, but don't expect to see it spelled out for us in the New York Times or the Washington Post, you know?
No, that's why you're here. All
Yeah.
right, so I'm going to combine, this is going to be a few questions in one, because this happened the last time we spoke. Like, my mind is just
Yeah,
firing on so many different
yeah.
levels, which I love about talking to you. So I know from my studies of propaganda that
Yeah.
propaganda was created to generate public support for war, right? So our government slash military propagandizes its own people so that they will support wars. So I'm wondering if this like military embrace of psychedelics is only relegated to active duty participants, or if they are also deploying them on the public in the same way they do with their, you know, their frequencies and lily waves and, you know, those other things. And I'm also wondering how this stands up to the recent uptick in the like microdosing conversation, which is, you know, so hip among Silicon Valley tech folk and otherwise, you know, conservative types who wouldn't otherwise dip their toes into the psychedelic realms.
Yeah. Oh, totally. So as for your first question, as far as like, we see how the military would have an interest in this for use on the battlefield or with troops, but do they have an interest in this among the general population as it results to warfare? I would argue yes, although this is, I mean, it's hotly contested, even though there's a lot of documentation out there. And again, I would encourage folks to check out Acid Dreams, but there's tons of books at this point that have been written about this. One that's more recent that I also highly recommend is Poisoner in Chief by Stephen Kinzer, which is about Sid Gottlieb, who was the director of the MK Ultra program for the CIA. And I mean, it's tough because there are documents that the military was actively engaging in experimenting on the public with drugs in the 50s and the 60s. In the 70s, a number of things happened. The Church Committee, the Rockefeller Commission, a number of other things. Essentially what happened is that the public gained knowledge of what the government had been doing with these drugs. And ever since then, the military industrial complex has been much more discreet with the information that they allow into the public about all this. So whereas we do have documents from like the 50s and the 60s explaining that the government has an active interest in, for example, like after World War II, a number of top personnel in the military were working with the big pharmaceutical companies like Merck to develop drugs that could incapacitate without killing people. And it's uh it's one thing to see how that would be used on the battlefield, but what's also interesting to get to your question is, as time goes on, there's actually substantial evidence that this was essentially applied to the general population. Now, I guess I will, I guess, say that, like, what I'm about to say is my argument that I work toward in the book. But again, a lot of the documents about this have been destroyed. A lot of the people who control the money, like, behind this, have been very quiet about their roles in all of this. So it's very difficult to say that we know, for example, what the motivations were of various people who were involved in the drug scene. But what's interesting is, like, if we examine, for example, Timothy Leary, or like any number, like, there's still, this is going on now, but Tim Leary is just a good one because a lot of people will know his name already. But, like, if one starts to examine who he was connected to, how he met the people who allowed him to get big in the field, the history of even his own family, like, okay, so actually Tim Leary is a really good kind of, like, case study in the relationship between the military and the psychedelic scene, because Tim himself insisted that he was actually conceived on a military base, specifically at West Point. Now, he was born at West Point, and in his memoir, he thinks that he was conceived there. Like, he thinks his parents actually knocked themselves up, like, at West Point, and that he was actually ushered into this world in a military base. Mm-hmm. Which, I just want to pause on that, because it speaks volumes to, like, all the information that we can then learn about him, which he actually served in the military during World War II. And it was on the GI Bill, which was a bill passed by the federal government that gave aid to troops returning from World War II, and in general going forward, that to help them go to school. And this has long been hotly contested as a mechanism that the government uses to essentially incentivize people to join the military, because then they'll pay for your education afterward. But this traces back more or less to World War II. And that was actually how Tim Leary got into school to study psychology, was through the GI Bill after his time in the military during World War II, which is interesting. And then if we look, for example, at, like, key moments in the popularization of acid in the 60s, a lot of which were tied to Leary in various ways, they often have very strange connections to the intelligence community and the military. And like, for example, The Human Being, which occurred in San Francisco, California in the late 60s, it's often, like, referred to as a historic event in kind of the evolution of the counterculture in the US and the birth of the hippie identity. But the people who organized the conference were connected to elite family that had people in the CIA that had been involved in diplomacy and espionage. And what's interesting is, like, if we look to the behavior of the organizers of The Human Being, for example, like, at The Human Being, Tim Leary was there as one of the main speakers, and he openly and very clearly urged people to not get involved with politics. And that he basically implied that politics was something for savage people, and that if you were truly enlightened, you did not concern yourself with such matters, and you would just spend all day getting high and fucking. And after the conference, like one of the main organizers of the Be-In was quoted as saying that the conference was to some extent a disappointment because Jerry Rubin, who was the infamous activist known with the Yuppies and Abby Hoffman, after the Be-In, he still identified as a Marxist. So according to one of the organizers of the Be-In, the festival did not really do what it was intended to do. Because Jerry Rubin is still a Marxist, dang it. We thought, it's like he didn't like that part he said, but what is implied is that the event was intended to like distract the activists from the politics and get them into the drugs and the music.
Right.
The more one digs into this period, there's just tons of clues like this, and I could go on and on for hours about all this kind of stuff where it's kind of like I said earlier as I was learning about it, where it's like just one thing here and there might not mean much if you don't really know the history to plug it into. So it's easy to dismiss for people who are new to this. But if you've been exposed to more and more of these, and you know the history of the US, and you're concerned about politics, all this stuff should be raising red flags. And it was for me, and there's just tons of examples of this throughout the history of psychedelics, and this kind of stuff is still going on now, I would argue. And my book is going to be full of all the evidence I've gathered in favor of that argument. But yeah, I'm happy to answer more. I hope that kind of, your question about the microdosing. Okay.
Wait, can we pause the microdosing, which I do want to come back to, only because what you just said validates something that I've been watching for the past couple weeks, and I've been talking to both Emily and Robert Forte about it, is, so I keep my eye on Aubrey Marcus, and I definitely, it's like, and one of my other questions is like, where do nootropics tie into this? Because he, has a foot in both worlds, and I see how these people who are into nootropics are also propagandizing the psychedelic community. And he recently, and the other piece that I see about that are these bromances that seem to be formed in shared psychedelic journeys, right? So many ways that these substances are being used to control and co-opt. And I recently saw an interview that Aubrey did with Robert Edward Grant. Do you know who that is?
Robert Edward Grant. Oh, I think you got me on that one.
He's being propped up. When I hear him speak, he's very intelligent, he's very wise, he has a lot of hermetic wisdom, he's a polymath, right? So he knows a lot about mathematics and science and astrology and numerology. And I'm like, wait a minute, what is what we call a modern day polymath is someone who's high up in secret societies. Like, it's all the stuff that they teach in secret societies, and who decides to go through all these courses of study except people who are Masons or Rosicrucians or whatever they may be. And so they were doing this podcast about hermetic wisdom, and I wasn't suspicious until I was suspicious. And they said, don't get involved in politics. It's all in your mind. There's nothing outside to fix. And I'm like, oh, let's get everyone to be apathetic and take no action while we mind fuck them and steer our world onto like really fucked territory.
Totally. That's a very great observation. It's interesting that you caught that. It also confirms that I guess this notion is out there still. Again, it's hard to say like what the motive is for this, but even if we look at just objectively how it functions in the broader like landscape, I don't think it's a positive one. But yeah, that's a great observation. It's very interesting.
And I think we can see it in the past few years. Like, I live in a very small town, and there are so many people here who know what's going on, but they're just in the love and light, cherry Mary sunshine. I'm just creating my own reality and listening to Esther Hicks. And it's like, well, if we had banded together, it wouldn't have gone as far as it has. It just
Yeah.
creates more and more apathetic, acquiescing
Yeah.
individuals who aren't standing up for their freedom.
Yeah. Oh, totally. Totally. Um, a couple different things that brings up for me.